Congratulations. You've just woken up in a small village in the year 1348. The bread's baking, the sun's out, your neighbor's yelling at his goat like every other morning. Today feels completely normal. By tonight, at least one person on your street will be dead. Not from old age, not from a fight, not from anything you can see coming. You don't have Google to look up the symptoms. You don't have a hospital 15 minutes away. You don't even have soap that actually works. What you have is a rumor from 3 villages over about a sickness that turns armpits into something out of a nightmare and kills you inside a week. You don't know it yet, but you're standing at the start of the deadliest event in recorded human history. Something that's about to kill 1 out of every 3 people you've ever met. Tonight, we're not doing kings. We're not doing famous names. History remembers. We're doing you. An ordinary person with an ordinary morning, about to find out exactly why you almost certainly wouldn't survive the Black Death. Hello, and welcome back to the Sleepless Storyteller, where the fire burns low, the night grows quiet, and history unfolds one gentle story at a time. I'm glad you're here tonight, so settle into your pillow, let your shoulders soften, and let the worries of today quietly fade away. Together, we'll discover what everyday life was really like during one of history's deadliest pandemics, and why surviving the Black Death was far more difficult than most of us can imagine. Before we begin, if these quiet journeys through history help you relax, I'd love for you to leave a like, subscribe, and ring the bell. It helps the Sleepless Storyteller reach more people looking for a peaceful story before sleep. Now, get comfortable, and let the story begin. Why you wouldn't survive the Black Death, the plague that killed half of Europe and changed the world forever. Chapter 1. A disease that began thousands of miles from where it would do its worst damage. The story of the Black Death does not begin in Europe at all. And understanding where it actually started tells you something important about exactly how connected the medieval world already was, centuries before anyone had a word for globalization. Modern genetic and historical research points to the plague's origins somewhere in Central Asia, likely in the region surrounding what is now called the Tian Shan mountain range, spanning parts of modern Kyrgyzstan and neighboring territory. Here, among wild rodent populations that had carried a particular strain of bacteria for a very long time without it becoming any wider human catastrophe, something changed sometime in the early 14th century, allowing the disease to spread more easily and more lethally than it ever had before. From this remote origin point, the disease found its way into the vast trading networks that the Mongol Empire had spent the previous century building and maintaining across an enormous stretch of Asia. The Mongols, whatever else can be said about the brutality of their conquests, had achieved something genuinely remarkable. A period of relative stability and open trade across thousands of miles of previously fragmented territory, sometimes called the Pax Mongolica, that allowed merchants, goods, and, as it would soon prove, disease to move across the continent with a speed and ease that would have been unimaginable in earlier centuries. Caravan routes carrying silk, spices, and countless other goods between East Asia and the Mediterranean world had, for generations, served as the arteries of medieval global commerce. Along these same routes, hidden in the fur of rodents and the fleas that lived on them, traveled the disease that was about to bring an entire civilization to its knees. Merchants moved from oasis town to oasis town, entirely unaware that their pack animals, their grain stores, and their own traveling companions might be carrying, in effect, a slow-moving catastrophe already gathering momentum behind them. By the 1340s, this disease had reached the Black Sea region, and it was here, at a fortified trading post under active military siege, that history would witness one of the most genuinely dramatic and consequential moments in the entire story of the Black Death. A moment that some contemporary chroniclers described in terms so vivid that historians still debate today exactly how literally we should take them. Chapter 2. The siege that may have launched a plague across an entire world. In 1346, Mongol forces laid siege to Kaffa, prosperous Genoedo, in 4th T. This siege, one of countless military conflicts of the era, would have remained a fairly ordinary footnote in medieval history were it not for what happened next. According to an account left behind by a notary named Gabriele de Mossi, writing some years after the events he described. According to this account, disease broke out among the sieging Mongol forces themselves, killing large numbers of soldiers before the siege could be brought to any decisive military conclusion. Rather than simply withdrawing in defeat, the account claims the Mongol commanders ordered the bodies of plague victims catapulted over the walls of Kaffa into the fortified city itself, in what would represent one of history's earliest documented attempts at deliberate biological warfare. Historians today debate exactly how much of this dramatic account to take at face value, noting that Dumuzi was not present at the siege himself and was writing based on second-hand reports, and further noting that the primary mechanism of plague transmission, through fleas rather than direct contact with the dead, makes it somewhat unclear whether catapulted corpses alone could have caused the outbreak that followed inside Kaffa's walls. What is not seriously disputed is that plague did break out within the besieged city, whatever the precise mechanism, and that the Genoese merchants trapped inside Kaffa, facing both military siege and a rapidly spreading epidemic, eventually made the fateful decision to abandon the city and sail home. Some of these fleeing ships carried, among their cargo and crew, the disease itself, embedded in the rats and fleas that traveled aboard virtually every merchant vessel of this era, as an unavoidable feature of long sea voyages. As these ships made their way westward across the Mediterranean, docking at ports along the way to resupply and trade, they carried with them, entirely unknowingly, the beginning of a catastrophe that would soon dwarf by many orders of magnitude the military conflict that had originally set these ships to flight. One of these ships, or a small group of them, would eventually make landfall at a Sicilian port, and what happened when they arrived would give an entire continent its very first, horrifying glimpse of what was coming for it. Chapter 3. The Ghost Ships that Arrived at Messina. In October of 1347, a small fleet of Genoese trading ships arrived at the Sicilian port of Messina, and what the people waiting on the docks discovered aboard these vessels has become one of the most chilling and frequently rote-polled moments in the terrorists. According to contemporary accounts, most of the sailors aboard these ships were already dead or dying by the time the vessels reached port, their bodies marked by the swellings and dark discolorations that would soon become horrifyingly familiar across the entire continent. Sicilian authorities, recognizing with real and immediate alarm that something was seriously wrong, ordered the ships expelled from the harbor, attempting, in one of history's earliest documented public health interventions, to prevent whatever disease these ships carried from spreading further into the city. It was already too late. The ships had docked long enough, and enough contact had already occurred between crew and shore for the disease to establish itself in Messina before authorities fully grasped the scale of the danger they were facing. Within weeks, the plague was spreading through the city itself, and from Messina, it began its relentless, unstoppable spread across Sicily, and from there onto the Italian mainland and outward across the whole of Europe. The speed of this spread genuinely shocked contemporary observers who had no framework for understanding contagion in the way modern medicine does, and who watched, with mounting terror, as the disease moved from city to city along the same trade routes and travel corridors that had, for centuries, been sources of prosperity and connection rather than mortal danger. Genoa itself, along with Venice and other major Italian trading ports, fell to the plague within months of the Messina outbreak, and from these major commercial hubs, the disease continued its relentless march outward, into France, into Spain, into England, and eventually into nearly every corner of Europe, from the Mediterranean coast all the way to the furthest reaches of Scandinavia. By the time the initial wave of this catastrophe finally began to subside, several years later, it would leave behind a continent transformed almost beyond recognition, and every single community it touched along the way would face the same urgent, terrifying question that Messina itself had confronted first. What exactly was this disease? And was there anything at all that could be done to stop it? Chapter 4. A world that had no idea what was actually attacking it. To understand just how helpless medieval society was in the face of this catastrophe, it's essential to understand what people at the time actually believed was causing it, because the true mechanism, the transmission of bacteria through fleas living on rats, and in some forms of the disease through the air itself between infected people, was completely and entirely unknown to anyone living through this era. The dominant medical theory of the time, inherited from ancient sources and widely accepted across Europe's medical establishment, held that disease spread through miasma, corrupted or foul air, often associated with decay, filth, and unfavorable alignments of the planets. This theory, while completely incorrect about the actual mechanism at work, was not entirely irrational given the observational tools available to medieval physicians. disease did seem to cluster around filthy, crowded conditions, and it did seem to travel through the air in certain circumstances, particularly with the pneumonic form of the plague, which genuinely could spread through respiratory droplets between people in close contact. Because of this theory, much of the era's medical response focused on efforts to purify the air rather than efforts that a modern understanding of contagion would suggest were more relevant. Quarantine of infected individuals and control of the rodent populations that were actually responsible for carrying the disease. Physicians recommended burning aromatic herbs and woods to cleanse the air of corruption, and wealthy households and civic authorities alike invested considerable effort in these fumigation efforts, entirely unaware that the actual danger lurked not in the air they were trying to purify, but in the rat populations and flea infestations that thrived in the same crowded, unsanitary conditions that made the air seem so foul in the first place. Some physicians, working from a different but equally mistaken theoretical framework, believed the plague was caused by an imbalance of the body's four humors, the ancient medical theory that attributed health and illness to the relative balance of blood, phlegm, and two forms of bile within the body. This theory led to treatments like bloodletting, intended to restore humoral balance, which in practice often weakened patients who are already critically ill, quite possibly hastening the deaths of people whose bodies desperately needed every resource available to fight the actual infection ravaging them. Astrology, too, played a genuine and widely respected role in how educated medieval society understood the plague's origins. A commission of physicians consulted by the King of France in the aftermath of the outbreak's arrival famously attributed the plague to a specific, unfavorable conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars that had occurred several years earlier, an explanation that carried real scientific authority within the intellectual framework of the era, however completely disconnected it was from the actual bacteriological reality of what was killing so many hundreds of thousands of people across the continent. Faced with a threat that not even the most educated minds of the age could correctly identify, ordinary people were left to face this catastrophe with theories that offered them almost no genuine protection at all, setting the stage for a period during which the actual, practical business of watching this disease unfold in your own body and in the bodies of everyone you loved would prove to be one of the most genuinely terrifying experiences a human being could endure. Chapter 5. What actually felt like to fall ill. If you practiced thick white, would you Christ now the half? The illness typically began with a sudden onset of fever, chills, and severe fatigue, symptoms general enough in their earliest hours that a person might initially hope they were dealing with something considerably less serious. Within a day or two, however, painful, swollen lymph nodes would begin to appear, most commonly in the groin, the armpit, or the neck, growing over the following days into the large, tender swellings that gave this particular form of the disease its name, the bubonic plague, named for these characteristic swellings, called buboes. Alongside these swellings, victims typically experienced severe headache, body aches, and a rapidly progressing weakness that could leave a previously healthy adult barely able to stand within just a couple of days of the first symptoms appearing. In many cases, dark, blotchy discoloration would develop on the skin, a symptom that, combined with the disease's terrifying mortality rate, likely contributed to the grim nickname history would eventually attach to this entire catastrophic era. The mortality rate for this bubonic form of the disease, even under the best care available at the time, was devastatingly high, with a significant majority of those who developed symptoms dying within about a week of the illness's onset. For those unfortunate enough to develop the disease's other, less common forms, a version that spread directly through the bloodstream, or a version that attacked the lungs directly and could spread from person to person through respiratory contact alone, the progression could be even faster and the mortality rate even higher, with some victims dying within just a day or two of their first symptoms appearing. For a family watching a loved one move through these stages, the experience was almost unbearably swift and almost unbearably helpless. There was, quite simply, no effective medical treatment available anywhere in the 14th century that could meaningfully alter the course of this disease once it had taken hold, and families faced the genuinely agonizing choice between staying close to a dying relative, risking their own exposure to the same fate, or fleeing in an attempt at self-preservation that meant an abandoning someone they loved to face their final days entirely alone. It's worth pausing here to understand something important about how contemporary observers actually experience this disease's spread through their own communities, because the sheer speed and scale of death, once the plague truly took hold in a given town or village, would create scenes of genuinely overwhelming, almost unimaginable devastation within the span of just a few short weeks. Chapter 6. When the living could no longer keep up with the dead. As the plague swept through a city or town, the sheer scale of mortality quickly overwhelmed every single Sith that sight me but it smells. Ordinary burial practices, involving individual graves, funeral services, and the careful, dignified handling of the deceased that medieval Christian society placed enormous cultural and religious importance upon, simply became impossible to maintain once death rates reached the catastrophic levels many communities experienced. In the hardest-hit cities, authorities were forced to dig massive communal burial pits, sometimes called plague pits, capable of receiving dozens or even hundreds of bodies at a time, a stark and deeply unsettling departure from the individual, ceremonially significant burials that these same communities would have insisted upon just months earlier. Carts moved through city streets, particularly at night, with workers calling out for households to bring out any bodies of those who had died, a grim daily ritual that became, in the hardest-hit areas, simply an accepted part of the town's routine functioning. These same workers, performing what was recognized even at the time as extraordinarily dangerous work, often faced significant social stigma and, understandably, considerable difficulty finding anyone willing to take on this essential but genuinely terrifying occupation, given the very reasonable fear that close contact with the dead and dying might bring the same fate down upon anyone handling the bodies. Contemporary chroniclers describe scenes that strain modern credulity, of entire households found dead together, of streets where the smell of decay became so overwhelming that it drove away anyone with the means to relocate elsewhere, and of cities where the ordinary rhythms of daily commerce and civic life simply ground to a halt as death rates climbed to levels that made normal economic and social activity genuinely impossible to sustain. The psychological toll of living through this scale of visible, constant death is genuinely difficult to overstate. Survivors of this era describe a world in which the normal boundaries between life's routine business and death's constant, overwhelming presence simply collapsed entirely, where a person might wake healthy, fall ill by midday, and be dead before the following sunrise, and where entire families, entire streets, and in the very worst affected areas, entire villages could be reduced to just a small handful of survivors within the span of a single devastating month. Faced with a catastrophe this total and this incomprehensible, it should perhaps come as no surprise that medieval society's response extended well beyond medicine and civic administration, reaching into the deepest and most desperate corners of religious faith, and, in some of the era's darkest and most tragic episodes, into outright violence against innocent people blamed, entirely wrongly, for a catastrophe that no human hand had actually caused. Chapter 7. The doctors who dressed like something out of a nightmare. If you had fallen seriously ill during the height of the plague, and been fortunate enough to have a physician available to examine you at all, you might have found yourself face to face with one of the most visually striking and, to modern eyes, genuinely unsettling figures medieval medicine ever produced. The plague doctor, dressed in a costume specifically designed to protect its wearer from what the era's dominant medical theory identified as the true danger of foul, corrupted air. The most iconic version of this costume, featuring a long, beak-like mask filled with aromatic herbs and dried flowers, intended to filter the corrupted air its wearer breathed, along with a long waxed overcoat meant to prevent direct contact with an infected patient's body, actually became widespread somewhat later than the initial outbreak of the 1340s, developed more fully in later centuries as the plague continued its recurring visits to European cities. But the underlying idea, that protective coverings and air filtration could help protect a physician from whatever corrupted the air around a plague victim, reflected genuine, sincere efforts by medieval and early modern medical practitioners to protect themselves while continuing to treat patients suffering from an illness that offered them very poor odds of survival either way. Physicians who treated plague victims occupied a genuinely difficult and often contradictory social position. Some fled the hardest-hit areas entirely, prioritizing their own survival over their professional obligations, a decision that drew real criticism from religious and civic authorities, but that, given the near-total absence of any effective treatment they could actually offer their patients, is perhaps more understandable than contemporary critics were willing to acknowledge. Others remained, treating patients with the very limited tools available to them, genuinely risking, and in a great many documented cases losing, their own lives in the process. The actual treatments available to these physicians, whatever their courage or dedication, offered patients very little genuine benefit. Bloodletting, the lancing and draining of buboes, and various herbal remedies and tonics were all employed with real sincerity and real hope by physicians desperate to offer their patients something, anything that might improve their chances. Modern medical understanding suggests that few, if any, of these interventions provided genuine benefit, and some, particularly aggressive bloodletting performed on patients already critically weakened by the disease itself, may well have hastened the deaths of patients who might otherwise have had at least some small chance of surviving their illness. This near-total absence of effective medical treatment left medieval society searching for answers and interventions well beyond the medical profession, and it was here, in this desperate search for meaning and protection or incompressible catastrophe, that some of the era's most dramatic and, in certain cases, most genuinely tragic responses to the plague would emerge. Chapter 8. The processions of men who whipped themselves through the streets. Among the many desperate responses to the plague, few were as bizdraing craked, wreck were in good shape. Flagellants organized themselves into traveling groups, sometimes numbering in the hundreds, who moved from town to town engaging in public rituals of self-punishment. Believing that the plague represented divine punishment for humanity's collective sins, and that sufficiently intense, visible penance might convince God to lift this catastrophic judgment from the world. These processions involved participants publicly whipping themselves and one another with knotted cords, often embedded with small metal points in ritualized ceremonies that drew large crowds of onlookers in the towns these groups passed through. The movement gained genuine, widespread popular support in its early stages, reflecting the sheer desperation of a society that had exhausted every conventional medical and religious response available to it, and that found, in this dramatic and visually overwhelming display of collective penance, at least some sense of taking meaningful action against a catastrophe that otherwise offered no obvious explanation or remedy at all. For many ordinary people watching these processions pass through their towns, the flagellants offered a compelling, if ultimately misguided, sense that something was actively being done to address the plague's spiritual root causes. However, the movement's increasingly radical and independent religious authority, operating outside the formal structure and oversight of the established church, eventually drew serious concern and opposition from church leadership, who worried, with some legitimate justification, that the flagellants' claims that direct spiritual authority in their sometimes violent, disorderly conduct as they moved between towns represented a genuine threat to established religious and civic order. By 1349, Pope Clement VI had formally condemned the movement, and civic authorities in several regions began actively suppressing flagellant processions, viewing them as an increasingly dangerous source of social disorder rather than a genuine source of spiritual comfort or protection. The flagellant movement's rapid rise and equally rapid suppression offers a genuinely revealing window into the sheer scale of psychological and spiritual desperation that the plague's incomprehensible devastation produced across European society. When conventional religious practice can receive a tasvis und things advocations situazimin escrations. 20s the nation prelable control or explanation, and tragically this same desperate search for answers for explanation and control or explanation. And tragically, this same desperate search for explanation and control would soon curdle, in many of the same communities, into something considerably darker and more genuinely destructive than public processions of self-inflicted pain. Chapter 9. Innest people bade date the doll wait state. That's we cited to be dual psychic my would is a shower of as blight. This accusation, which spread across various parts of Europe during the plague years, had no basis in fact whatsoever, and it reflected long-standing patterns of religious prejudice and social scapegoating that predated the plague itself by many centuries, patterns that found, in this moment of overwhelming societal terror and incomprehension, a horrifyingly effective vehicle for renewed and intensified violence. Communities searching desperately for some explanation for a catastrophe that medieval science and medicine simply could not adequately account for found, in existing prejudice against Jewish minorities, a ready-made target for blame that required no genuine evidence to gain widespread, and often lethal, acceptance. The consequences of this false accusation were genuinely catastrophic for Jewish communities across significant portions of Europe. Numerous towns and cities, particularly across German-speaking territories, saw organized violence against their Jewish populations, in some documented instances amounting to the wholesale destruction of entire Jewish communities that, in several cases, had existed in a given location for generations. Some Jewish communities faced formal expulsion, while others faced direct violence carried out by mobs acting on false accusations that local and religious authorities frequently failed to meaningfully investigate or challenge before violence occurred. It's worth noting, with real and important historical significance, that Pope Clement VI, in a series of formal papal statements issued during this period, explicitly condemned these accusations and this violence, correctly pointing out that Jewish communities were dying from the plague at rates similar to the wider population, a fact that should have made the poisoning accusation obviously implausible to any observer willing to consider the evidence honestly. Despite this formal papal condemnation, violence against Jewish communities continued across many affected regions, driven by local prejudice and mob violence that religious authority, even at its highest level, proved unable to fully prevent or suppress. This dark chapter of the plague's history deserves to be remembered clearly and honestly, without softening or minimizing its genuine horror, because it represents something that recurs in different forms across many of history's greatest catastrophes: the tendency of frightened, desperate populations to seek someone to blame, and the genuine lethal danger this impulse poses to minority communities who become convenient targets for violence that has nothing whatsoever to do with anything they actually did. Understanding this pattern honestly is essential to understanding not just the Black Death itself, but the broader, recurring human tendency towards scapegoating that this catastrophe, tragically, brought into such stark and violent relief. Chapter 10. The village that chose to save everyone else by staying where they were. Not every response to plague was born of violence or desperate superstition. Centuries after the initial catastrophe of 1347, when the same disease returned to strike England once more during a later outbreak in 1665 and 1666, one small English village produced a story of such genuine, deliberate courage that it remains to this day one of the most remarkable accounts of collective sacrifice in the entire history of this disease. The village of Eyam in Derbyshire first encountered plague when a local tailor received a shipment of cloth from London that, unknown to him, carried infected fleas. Within days, members of his household began falling ill and dying, and as the disease began spreading through the village, its residents faced an agonizing choice about how to respond to a catastrophe that had, by this point in history, already been terrorizing Europe intermittently for over 3 centuries. Under the guidance of their local rector, a man named William Mompesson, working alongside his predecessor Thomas Stanley, the village made an extraordinary and genuinely selfless decision rather than fleeing to escape the disease. As many wealthier residents of other plague-stricken communities had historically done, the people of Eyam chose to voluntarily quarantine their entire village, cutting themselves off from the surrounding countryside in order to prevent the plague from spreading to neighboring towns and villages. The village established a boundary stone system where local landowners from surrounding areas would leave food and supplies at designated markers outside the village boundary, often exchanging money that had been soaked in vinegar, which villagers believed, with some genuine if imperfect scientific basis, might help disinfect coins passing between the quarantined village and the outside world. Residents committed to remaining within this boundary for over a year, even as the disease continued spreading through their own community, killing, by the most careful historical estimates, several hundred of the village's residents out of a population that had numbered only a few hundred people to begin with. The human cost of this decision was genuinely staggering, and the stories that survive from this period are almost unbearably poignant, including the account of a woman named Elizabeth Hancock, who reportedly buried 6 of her own children and her husband within the span of just 8 days, digging their graves herself in a field near her home because no one else remained healthy enough or willing enough to risk close contact in order to help her. And yet, by the time the outbreak finally subsided, the village's extraordinary sacrifice appears to have genuinely succeeded in its central goal. Surrounding communities that could easily have suffered the same catastrophic mortality were largely spared, protected by the deliberate, courageous isolation that the people of Eyam chose to impose upon themselves, rather than risk carrying this disease to anyone beyond their own village boundary. Chapter 11. The word we still use today. Born from their days, all their alticate coast. The maritime city-state of Ragusa, located in what is now Dubrovnik in modern Croatia, implemented in 1377 a formal policy requiring ships arriving from plague-affected areas to wait in isolation for a specified period before their crew and cargo would be permitted to enter the city itself. This waiting period was initially set at 30 days, a duration the city's authorities eventually extended to 40 days, a period that, in the local Venetian-influenced dialect of the era, came to be known by a term derived from the word for 40, giving us, directly and quite literally, the origin of the modern English word quarantine. This policy represented a genuinely remarkable public health innovation developed centuries before any scientific understanding of germ theory or bacterial transmission existed to formally justify it. Ragusa's authorities had, through careful observation rather than any formal scientific framework, correctly identified that isolating potentially infected arrivals for a sufficient period could help prevent the disease from establishing itself within the city, even without understanding the actual biological mechanism involving infected fleas traveling aboard ships and their rat populations that made this isolation period genuinely effective. Other Mediterranean port cities gradually adopted similar quarantine policies in the years and decades that followed Ragusa's pioneering example, establishing a practical, if imperfectly understood, framework for disease control that would remain a cornerstone of public health practice for centuries to come, extending, in modified and scientifically refined form, all the way into the modern era's own responses to infectious disease outbreaks. It's worth appreciating just how significant this innovation actually was, emerging as it did from a society that possessed no genuine scientific understanding of what actually caused the plague, or how it actually spread from person to person and place to place. Through careful, practical observation of patterns, rather than any correct underlying theory, the process, Wintwain, Tomatidis, Brunmeters was Entraspi's public health intervention emerging from an era when so many other responses to this catastrophe, from bloodletting to well-poisoning accusations, proved either entirely ineffective or, in the case of the persecution already described, genuinely, changually, described, more in it right, big mate. Before the plague, medieval European society operated under a rigid feudal system in which peasants, tied to the land they worked through a web of obligations to local lords, had very little bargaining power over their own labor or living conditions. Land was, relative to the available labor force, genuinely scarce, and this scarcity gave landowners enormous leverage over the peasants who depended on access to that land for their own survival. The plague's catastrophic mortality rate fundamentally and permanently inverted this basic economic relationship. With a third to a half of the population dead, labor itself suddenly became genuinely scarce, while the land that had previously been in such short supply relative to available workers now sat abandoned in enormous quantities, its former occupants having died without any surviving family able or willing to continue working it. This new economic reality gave surviving peasants a degree of leverage over their own labor that would have been simply unimaginable in the years before the plague struck. Workers found themselves able to demand higher wages, better working conditions, and, in many documented instances, greater personal freedom from the restrictive feudal obligations that had bound previous generations of peasants to a single lord and a single piece of land for their entire working lives. Landlords, desperate to find anyone willing to work their now underpopulated estates, found themselves competing against one another for a genuinely scarce labor supply, driving up wages and gradually undermining the entire foundational logic of the feudal system that had structured European society for centuries. This transformation did not occur smoothly or without genuine resistance from the landowning class, whose economic and social power depended directly on maintaining the pre-plague status quo of abundant, cheap, and legally restricted peasant labor. Across various parts of Europe, ruling authorities attempted to legally suppress these newly empowered demands, passing legislation intended to cap wages at pre-plague levels and restrict peasants' newfound freedom of movement between different landowners' estates. Peterpimatus the Matus session, return, we mat haven Gemini sessions compromiters fought across the whole of the affected population, setting the stage for a genuine and in at least one famous instance genuinely explosive confrontation between a peasant cohort. The in build readamate Saturday with the English Parliament, in the years following the initial plague outbreak, had passed a series of laws known collectively as the Statute of Labourers, specifically intended to cap peasant wages at pre-plague levels and restrict the newfound freedom of movement that surviving peasants had begun to exercise in the labor-scarce economy that followed the catastrophe. These laws, deeply unpopular among the peasant population that had only recently discovered genuine economic leverage for the first time in generations, created lasting resentment that continued building steadily across the following decades. This resentment finally erupted into open, organized revolt in 1381, triggered immediately by the imposition of a deeply unpopular poll tax intended to fund England's ongoing military conflicts in France. But drawing on decades of accumulated frustration over wage restrictions, continued feudal obligations, and the broader sense among the peasant population that the ruling class was actively working to reverse the genuine gains in freedom and bargaining power that the plague's catastrophic mortality had inadvertently handed to them. The resulting uprising, which historians now generally refer to as the Peasants' Revolt, saw tens of thousands of common people drawn from across significant portions of southeastern England march on London itself, briefly overwhelming royal authority and forcing a direct, remarkable confrontation between the young King Richard II and the rebellion's leadership. The rebels, under leaders including a man named Wat Tyler, presented genuinely radical demands, calling for an end to serfdom, fairer taxation, and broader freedoms for England's common peasant population. The revolt ultimately ended in violent suppression, with Wat Tyler killed during a tense confrontation with royal authorities, and the broader uprising crushed through a combination of military force and, in some cases, deceptive royal promises that were subsequently abandoned once the immediate crisis had passed. In the narrow, immediate sense, the revolt failed to achieve its explicit demands. But in the broader, longer-term sense, the underlying economic transformation that had made this uprising possible in the first place, the genuine scarcity of labor and the resulting leverage it gave to England's peasant population, continued steadily eroding the foundations of feudal society across the following decades, regardless of the specific outcome of this single dramatic confrontation, demonstrating just how thoroughly the plague's catastrophic mortality had already begun reshaping the basic economic and social structure of English society. Whatever any single king or parliament might meest nachlech slekrekten that's an underlag strict about it. Chapter 14. The Art That Refused to Look Away from Death. Beyond its economic and political consequences, the Black Death left a profound and lasting mark on European culture, art, and literature, as an entire civilization grappled, through creative expression, with an experience of mass death that conventional religious and philosophical frameworks often struggled to fully process or explain. One of the most distinctive artistic responses to emerge from this era was a genre that art historians now call the dance macabre, or dance of death, depicting in paintings, woodcuts, and other visual media skeletal figures representing death leading people from every level of society, kings, clergy, merchants, and peasants alike, in a macabre procession toward the grave. This artistic motif, which spread widely across Europe in the decades following the initial plague outbreak, reflected a genuinely significant shift in how European society understood mortality, emphasizing death's complete indifference to earthly rank or wealth in a way that would have carried genuinely radical social implications in a society otherwise structured so rigidly around hierarchy and social distinction. Literature, too, grappled directly with the plague's overwhelming presence, perhaps most famously in the work of the Italian writer Giovanni Boccaccio. His collection of tales, composed in the years immediately following the initial 1348 outbreak in Florence, is framed around a group of young people who flee the plague-stricken city to a country estate, where they while away their days of voluntary isolation by taking turns telling stories to one another. This framing device offers a genuinely striking historical parallel to exactly the kind of storytelling tradition you're listening to right now. People, isolated from a world in crisis, finding comfort, distraction, and genuine human connection through the simple, enduring act of sharing stories with one another. religious art and literature of the period also underwent significant transformation, with an increased emphasis on themes of mortality, judgment, and the fragility of earthly existence, reflecting a society that had been forced, through direct and overwhelming experience, to confront questions about death, faith, and meaning that previous generations had been able to engage with in a considerably more abstract, theoretical way. Memento mori imagery, literally meaning, remember that you must die, proliferated across European art in the decades following the plague, appearing in everything from elaborate tomb sculptures to small personal devotional objects intended to remind their owners of life's fundamental fragility and the ever-present nearness of mortality. This cultural transformation, emerging directly from a society's attempt to process genuinely unprecedented mass trauma, offers a compelling reminder that even history's darkest catastrophes tend to produce, alongside their genuine devastation, forms of creative and cultural expression that help subsequent generations understand, remember, and find some form of meaning within experiences that might otherwise remain simply, unbearably incomprehensible. Chapter 15. The numbers that still genuinely shock modern historians, having walked the stride of their human bees. Was mind jammed modern historians, drawing on careful analysis of surviving tax records, church registries, and other administrative documents from across medieval Europe, generally estimate that the initial wave of plague between 1347 and 1351 killed somewhere between 30 and 50% of Europe's entire population, figures that translate to a death toll numbering in the tens of millions of people across just a few catastrophic years. Some individual cities and regions experienced even more severe mortality, with certain communities losing more than half, and in some particularly devastated areas, as much as 2/3 of their entire population within the span of a single outbreak. To place this in a comparative perspective that might help convey its true scale, consider that this level of mortality, applied proportionally to a modern population, would represent a catastrophe considerably more severe than any war, famine, or disease outbreak that has occurred anywhere in the world within living memory. A level of sudden, concentrated mortality that modern societies, with all their accumulated wealth, technology, and public health infrastructure, have simply never had to directly confront in anything approaching this proportional scale. The plague's demographic impact extended, moreover, well beyond this single initial outbreak. The disease returned repeatedly across the following several centuries, with significant recurring outbreaks striking various parts of Europe throughout the remainder of the 14th century, and continuing, with gradually diminishing but still genuinely severe impact, through the 15th, 16th, and even into the 17th century, as demonstrated by the later English outbreak that struck the village of Eyam and the wider country during the 1660s. The Zufgelbanes. Rautemortes Auschwitz which ends were not as made for sequent where messens once spent that shaped daily life, urban planning, religious practice, and etchenabazes quanchamiscenches, as each new generation grew up understanding that this particular catastrophe might, at any time, return once more to claim a significant portion of their own. Chapter 6. Each winder sits had done to their parent. Herbal pouches and nosegays, small bundles of aromatic flowers and herbs carried on the person or hung in doorways, became genuinely widespread protective measures rooted directly in the era's miasma theory of disease. The idea, sincerely believed across every level of society from peasant households to royal courts, was that pleasant, strong-smelling herbs could help ward off the corrupted air believed to carry the disease. Wealthy households invested considerable resources in elaborate versions of these protective sachets, while poorer families relied on whatever aromatic plants they could gather locally, a practice that, however scientifically misguided, at least offered people some small, tangible sense of taking protective action against a threat that otherwise felt entirely beyond their control. So-called plague waters, herbal tonics brewed from various combinations of vinegar, wine, and aromatic herbs, circulated widely as both preventative treatments and attempted cures, sold by apothecaries and traveling merchants who, whatever their genuine intentions, were offering products with essentially no verified medical benefit against the actual bacterial infection at work. Some of these preparations, involving vinegar in particular, may have offered marginal antiseptic benefit in very specific, limited circumstances, but none came anywhere close to representing a genuine treatment for an infection that modern medicine would not develop effective antibiotic treatment for until many centuries later. Religious charms and amulets. often combining Christian prayer with older folk traditions, were worn and displayed widely as protective measures, reflecting the deeply intertwined nature of medical and spiritual belief in medieval society, where a clear boundary between physical illness and spiritual affliction simply did not exist in the way modern secular medicine would eventually come to understand it. Certain saints became particularly associated with plague protection, and prayers and pilgrimages devoted to these figures increased dramatically during outbreak periods, reflecting genuine, sincere religious devotion alongside the practical desperation driving people to seek any available source of protection. It's worth addressing directly a piece of popular folklore that many people today associate with the plague, regarding the origins of a well-known children's nursery rhyme. Despite widespread popular belief connecting this particular rhyme directly to plague symptoms and mass burial practices, the historical and linguistic evidence for this connection is genuinely quite weak, and most serious folklore historians now regard this popular association as a later invention rather than a genuine historical connection to the 14th century catastrophe, offering a useful reminder that popular memory of the plague, however genuinely rooted in real historical horror, has also accumulated a considerable amount of folklore and mystification ascends the nth of the equation. Chapter 17. The Plague's Journey Through a Wider World Than Europe Alone. It's worth correcting a common misconception before continuing further. The Black Death was never simply a European catastrophe, and understanding its impact across the wider medieval world reveals just how genuinely global this disease's devastation actually was. The Islamic world, stretching across North Africa, the Middle East, and significant portions of Central and South Asia, experienced the plague's devastation with a severity fully comparable to what befell Europe, and Arabic-language chroniclers of the period left behind detailed, valuable first-hand accounts of the disease's progression through major cities across this vast region. The great medieval traveler Ibn Battuta, whose extensive journeys across the Islamic world make him one of history's most valuable first-hand chroniclers of this era, recorded his own direct encounters with plague-stricken cities during his travels, describing scenes of mass mortality and civic disruption that closely mirror the accounts left behind by European chroniclers experiencing the same catastrophe in their own cities. Cairo, one of the medieval world's largest and most prosperous cities, suffered catastrophic mortality during the plague years, with contemporary Arabic chroniclers describing daily death tolls that overwhelmed the city's ability to conduct normal burial practices, in scenes genuinely similar to those already described in European cities like Florence and London. The historian Ibn Khaldun, one of the medieval Islamic world's most significant intellectual figures, lost both of his own parents to the plague, and later wrote with genuine philosophical depth about the disease's broader civilizational impact, reflecting on how such catastrophic sudden depopulation could fundamentally disrupt not just individual lives, but the broader economic and cultural foundations of entire societies. The disease's spread through these regions followed similar trade route patterns to its European spread, carried along the same extensive network of Silk Road and Mediterranean trade connections that had, for centuries, connected the Islamic world to both East Asia and Europe. This shared vulnerability to a disease traveling along shared trade networks offers a genuinely important reminder that the medieval world, whatever its political and religious divisions, was already deeply interconnected through commerce in ways that made a catastrophe of this scale almost impossible to contain within any single civilization's borders once it had begun its initial spread. Understanding this broader global context helps correct a popular tendency to think of the Black Death purely as a European historical event, when in genuine historical reality, it represented a catastrophe of truly global scale, striking societies across an enormous stretch of the medieval world with comparable severity and leaving behind across every affected civilization broadly similar patterns of mass mortality, social disruption, and desperate searching for explanation, and can direct that no society anywhere where with Chapter 18. The city that inspired 100 stories told to escape it. Among all the cities that suffered through the plague's initial devastating wave, Florence holds a particularly significant place in how later generations would come to understand and remember this catastrophe, thanks largely to the vivid, detailed account left behind by the writer Giovanni Boccaccio, whose personal experience of the outbreak in his own city provided the framing device for one of the era's most significant surviving works of literature. Florence in 1348 was one of medieval Europe's largest, wealthiest, and most culturally significant cities, and the plague's arrival there produced scenes of devastation that Boccaccio himself, writing shortly after the outbreak's worst period had passed, described in genuinely vivid and disturbing detail as an introduction to his own famous collection of tales. He described a city where ordinary social bonds and civic order had begun to visibly break down under the sheer pressure of mass mortality, where some residents turned to increasingly desperate revelry and indulgence in the face of what felt like inevitable death, while others retreated into extreme isolation, refusing all contact with the outside world in a desperate, if largely ineffective, attempt at self-protection. Boccaccio described the complete breakdown of ordinary funeral customs within the city, with bodies sometimes left in the street for extended periods before burial parties could attend to them, and with the city's traditional, elaborate funeral rituals abandoned entirely in favor of hasty mass burials simply intended to remove the dead from public view as quickly as possible. He described family members abandoning one another out of genuine terror of contagion, parents leaving sick children and children abandoning elderly parents. A genuinely wrenching testament to just how thoroughly this catastrophe overwhelmed even the most basic, previously unquestionable bonds of family loyalty and care. It was against this backdrop of genuine civic and social collapse that Boccaccio constructed his famous literary framing device, a group of 10 young Florentines, 7 women and 3 men, who flee the plague-stricken city together for a country estate where they pass their days of voluntary isolation by taking turns telling stories to entertain and distract one another from the horror they've left behind. This framing device, whatever its literary sophistication, reflects something genuinely important and universal about how people actually cope with overwhelming catastrophe. The deep, enduring human need for connection, distraction, and shared narrative even, and perhaps especially in the very worst of circumstances. Florence's particular experience of the plague, preserved so vividly through Boccaccio's own first-hand account, has become, across the centuries since, one of the single most historically valuable windows we possess into exactly what the psychological and social experience of living through this catastrophe actually felt like from the inside, a detailed, personal testimony that helps transform the plague from an abstract statistic into the genuinely lived, deeply human experience that this story has tried, throughout to help you understand and feel for yourself. Chapter 19. The children left with no one. Among the many genuine tragedies the plague inflicted, one of the most heartbreaking and one that receives comparatively little attention in popular retellings of this history, involves the enormous number of children left orphaned by a catastrophe that showed no particular mercy toward the very young. Children who lost both parents to the plague faced a genuinely precarious situation in medieval society, which possessed nothing resembling the formal orphanage systems or child welfare institutions the later eras would eventually develop. In the immediate aftermath of a severe local outbreak, surviving relatives, neighbors, or, in the absence of any willing family connection, local religious institutions typically absorbed orphan children as best they could, though the sheer scale of mortality in the hardest-hit communities sometimes meant that entire extended families were wiped out together, leaving orphan children with genuinely nowhere obvious to turn. Monasteries and convents, already established as centers of charitable activity within medieval society, took in a significant number of plague orphans during this period, providing basic shelter, food, and religious education in exchange for the children's eventual labor, or, in some cases, their commitment to religious life once they reached adulthood. This arrangement, while providing genuine practical shelter for children who might otherwise have faced genuine destitution, offered these orphan children very little choice or autonomy over the shape their own future lives would take. Wealthier orphan children, particularly those who stood to inherit property or title from deceased parents, sometimes became the subject of genuine legal and family disputes, as surviving relatives maneuvered to gain guardianship over both the orphan child and the property or wealth they stood to inherit, a dynamic that added a layer of genuine legal and financial complexity to what was already, for the children themselves, an experience of profound personal loss and displacement. A Finnaby Square is situated to stick them in the twain sheep that Stennikin to Semitic rights of the Carrix, the Puntachimac, Bagavnin. Why the 5 stick where artists Pabak is great to be touched streets forgot to all the glit to bank to hike tat have a crumbled in about. The underlying reason for this recurring pattern lies in the disease's genuine biological reservoir among wild rodent populations across various parts of Europe, Asia, and North Africa, populations that continued carrying the bacteria responsible for the disease long after any individual human outbreak had run its course. As long as these rodent populations and the fleas living among them continued existing in reasonable proximity to human settlements, the genuine possibility of renewed transmission into the human population remained an ever-present, if unpredictable, threat. Major outbreaks recurred across various parts of Europe throughout the remainder of the 14th century and continued, with somewhat diminishing but still genuinely severe impact, through the 15th and 16th centuries. Some of these later outbreaks approached the scale and severity of the original 1347 catastrophe in specific affected regions, even though the disease, considered across the entirety of Europe, generally did not achieve quite the same continent-wide, near-simultaneous devastation of that first terrible wave. The 17th century saw several more severe outbreaks, including the Great Plague of London in 1665, which killed a substantial portion of that city's population within a single devastating year, and which, as already discussed, prompted the small village of Iam's extraordinary act of collective self-sacrifice in an effort to prevent the disease's further spread into the surrounding Derbyshire countryside. It would not be until considerably later, well into the modern scientific era, that researchers finally identified the actual bacterial cause of the plague and developed genuine understanding of its transmission through fleas and rodent populations, knowledge that finally allowed for effective science-based prevention and treatment measures that could genuinely and permanently break this centuries-long cycle of recurring catastrophic outbreaks. For the many generations of Europeans, and indeed people across the wider affected regions of Asia and North Africa, who lived and died in the centuries between the initial 1347 catastrophe and the eventual development of genuine scientific understanding, the plague remained a persistent, terrifying background reality of daily life, not a single historical event safely confined to the past, but a recurring, unpredictable threat that any given generation might, at any time, find themselves forced to confront once again, exactly as their grandparent. Chapter 21. Separating the real history from the stories that grew around it. Given the plague's genuinely overwhelming historical significance, it should perhaps come as no surprise that popular memory has, across the many centuries since, accumulated a considerable amount of folklore, exaggeration, and outright myth alongside the genuine historical record. And separating fact from later embellishment helps ensure that our understanding of this catastrophe remains genuinely accurate, rather than distorted by centuries of accumulated retelling. We've already addressed one significant example directly, the popular association between a well-known children's nursery rhyme and plague symptoms, a connection that most serious folklore historians now regard as a considerably later invention rather than a genuine historical artifact of the 14th century catastrophe itself. This example illustrates a broader pattern worth understanding. Popular culture has, across the centuries, absorbed the plague as a kind of shorthand for medieval catastrophe generally, sometimes attaching genuine historical events to it that actually belong to entirely different diseases, different centuries, or different circumstances altogether. Some popular accounts of the plague have also, across the centuries, exaggerated or oversimplified specific details for dramatic effect, sometimes presenting death toll estimates with a false, misleading precision that the actual surviving historical evidence drawn from incomplete medieval record-keeping genuinely cannot support with total certainty. Modern historians, working carefully with the imperfect surviving evidence available to them, generally present their mortality estimates as reasonable ranges rather than precise figures, reflecting an honest acknowledgement of the genuine uncertainty involved in reconstructing exact population figures from incomplete medieval administrative records. Other popular myths surrounding the plague include exaggerated claims about specific medical treatments or preventative measures that achieved genuine effectiveness against the disease, when in historical reality, as this story has already discussed at considerable length, essentially no medical intervention available during the medieval period offered any genuine, scientifically verified protection against or treatment for the actual bacterial infection at the heart of this catastrophe. and the sociosignet is sigori quite annis from the task spread retrievings or like script garbisting at the stunably a wheezin it is the besigan and bearing siva leadis and raken or chime, but mumbarithing it's the treatment stagnant of real that courting squeptimini and targeting in its stingwell but e to Canadian perspellin rickings to court 20 to about their carving and horrits. Shasterblay iniquium bellaby stick better cabbage many to be a kivistic serbic with these time commits to have tried to retard to image we will end up repeat divide but did about out and discriminate desk. These institutions, often called pest houses or, in some regions, lazarettos, functioned as dedicated isolation facilities where suspected or confirmed plague victims could be housed separately from the general population, reflecting a growing, if still scientifically incomplete, civic understanding that isolating the sick from the healthy offered genuine, practical benefit in limiting a given outbreak's spread. Major cities across Europe, particularly following the initial catastrophic wave of the 1340s, invested increasing civic resources in establishing and maintaining these facilities as a standard feature of urban public health infrastructure. Conditions within these pest houses varied considerably depending on the specific city, era, and available civic resources, but they generally offered fairly minimal comfort, reflecting both the limited medical resources available to treat the disease and the genuine fear that staff working within these facilities reasonably felt about their own exposure risk. Staffing these institutions proved a persistent, genuine challenge, since the work carried obvious and substantial personal danger, and cities often struggled to find sufficient willing workers, sometimes resorting to offering premium wages or, in some documented cases, drawing on individuals who had already survived a previous plague infection and were believed, correctly in many cases, to have developed some meaningful degree of subsequent immunity. Beyond dedicated isolation facilities, cities also developed increasingly sophisticated civic administrative responses to recurring outbreaks, including formal systems for tracking and reporting suspected cases, restrictions on public gatherings during active outbreaks, and, building on the quarantine principles Ragusa had pioneered generations earlier, increasingly standardized procedures for isolating ships and travelers arriving from known outbreak areas. Some cities appointed dedicated public health officials specifically tasked with monitoring and responding to plague activity, an early and genuinely significant precursor to the organized public health administration that would eventually become a standard feature of modern governance. These evolving institutional responses, however perthy, writing want that whilst free sankit, writing a society that even without correct scientific understanding of the underlying bacterial cause, had nonetheless developed increasingly sophisticated practical strategies for limiting or getting at signing its under's word, increasing and sensing within age stone, recoursing designed, shared with a tand, at least timed, Chate 23. The shied, cheed, dried chef face. The Great Plague of London, striking the city with severe intensity in 1665, killed a substantial portion of London's population within a single year, with mortality reaching its most severe peak during the hot summer months, when conditions proved particularly favorable for the disease's continued spread through the city's crowded, unsanitary streets. Wealthy Londoners, who possessed the means to do so, fled the city entirely for the duration of the outbreak, retreating to country estates in a pattern that echoed, in its basic structure, similar responses to plague outbreaks across the preceding 3 centuries, while the city's poorer residents, lacking any such option, remained behind to face the outbreak directly, bearing, as had so often been the case throughout this disease's long history, a disproportionate share of its devastating mortality. Civic authorities implemented increasingly sophisticated public health measures during this outbreak, including formal quarantine requirements for infected households, mandatory reporting of plague deaths, and restrictions on public gatherings, reflecting centuries of accumulated, if still scientifically incomplete, civic learning about how to respond to this recurring threat. Despite these measures, the outbreak's mortality reached genuinely staggering levels before finally beginning to subside as the weather cooled toward the end of the year. Remarkably, London's ordeal was not yet finished. In September of 1666, just as the city was beginning to recover from the plague's devastating mortality, a fire broke out in a bakery near London Bridge that rapidly spread through the city's densely packed, largely wooden buildings, ultimately destroying a substantial portion of London within the span of just a few catastrophic days. This Great Fire of London, while representing a genuinely separate catastrophe from the plague outbreak that had preceded it by mere months, is sometimes credited by historians with an unexpected and genuinely significant silver lining: the fire's destruction of much of London's old, cramped, rat-infested housing stock and the city's subsequent rebuilding with somewhat improved sanitation and construction standards may have contributed to London's markedly reduced plague mortality in the centuries that followed, though historians continue to debate exactly how much credit the fire it's in qual it. This report shapes Sybil's odets. The Apquentuzar is C21 is my twos were called upon to endure within an almost unbelievably short span of time, and stands as one of history's more dramatic examples were called upon to endure within an almost short span of time, and stand as one of history's more justain, jaftuit. With such an enormous portion of the adult population dying within a short span of years, an unprecedented number of women found themselves widowed, often inheriting property, business interests, or land that had previously belonged to a deceased husband in a legal and social environment where women's independent property ownership had traditionally been quite limited and quite carefully circumscribed by prevailing law and custom. This sudden, widespread reality of female property inheritance, however tragic in its immediate cause, created genuine new opportunities for economic independence and social standing that a considerable number of surviving women found themselves navigating for the very first time. Some widows used this newfound property and economic standing to establish genuine independent businesses, taking over trades or commercial enterprises that had previously belonged to deceased husbands and, in a meaningful number of documented cases, running these enterprises with real skill and success in their own right. Guild records from various European cities in the decades following the plague show a genuinely notable increase in women operating independently within trades that had previously been almost exclusively male-dominated, reflecting both the practical necessity created by the labor shortage already discussed at length and the new property and capital that widowhood had, in many individual cases, placed directly into women's own hands. Marriage patterns themselves shifted noticeably in the plague's aftermath as well, with many widows choosing to remarry, given the genuine economic and social advantages that marriage still generally offered women in this era, but doing so, in many documented cases, from a position of considerably greater personal leverage and negotiating power than an unmarried woman entering her very first marriage might typically have possessed, given her existing independent property, and an unmarried woman entering her very first marriage might typically have possessed, given her excess why the costly hard words. This shift in women's economic and the social position following the peeding, Sintadis sit finding, quote, representing the sentiment of quertimeters the PT's broader legacy of social transformation, demonstrative once again just how to reshaped nearly every dimension of European society, extending its transformative restraint to his life, testy rastri, tree straight, nearly every testint of nortiafty. With quote, 25 tabi stand. The bacterium responsible for plague, formally identified and named Yersinia pestis, was first isolated by researchers during a separate, later plague outbreak that struck Hong Kong in the 1890s, providing modern medicine with its first genuine scientific understanding of the specific pathogen responsible for this ancient and recurring scourge, along with a clear understanding of its transmission through fleas living on infected rodent populations. This discovery, occurring more than 5 centuries after the initial 14th century catastrophe, finally provided modern science with a genuine biological explanation for a disease that medieval society had been forced to confront with nothing more than miasma theory and desperate, ultimately ineffective folk remedies. Even with this modern bacteriological understanding established, however, a genuine historical question remained open for further debate among historians and scientists. Could researchers definitively confirm that this same specific bacterium, Yersinia pestis, was truly responsible for the medieval Black Death itself, given that no direct biological samples from the 14th century had, for obvious reasons, ever been available for direct scientific analysis? Some historians had, over the years, proposed alternative theories suggesting that the medieval catastrophe might have actually involved an entirely different pathogen, given certain aspects of the historical descriptions that seemed, to some researchers, to not perfectly match the transmission patterns of confirmed modern plague outbreaks. This genuine scientific uncertainty was finally and definitively resolved in the early 21st century, when researchers employing sophisticated new techniques for extracting and analyzing ancient DNA successfully recovered genetic material directly from the teeth of skeletons excavated from confirmed medieval plague burial pits across several European countries. This groundbreaking research conclusively confirmed the presence of Yersinia pestis DNA within these centuries-old remains, providing definitive, direct biological proof that the same bacterium responsible for the well-understood modern form of plague was indeed the genuine cause of the medieval catastrophe, finally and conclusively settling a scientific debate that had persisted for well over a century since the bacterium's initial modern identification. This remarkable scientific achievement, extracting genuine conclusive biological evidence directly from the remains of people who died more than 6 centuries earlier, offers a genuinely fitting final testament to just how much this catastrophe continues to fascinate and inform modern science and modern historical understanding, even so many centuries after it first swept across an unsuspecting medieval world. The people whose remains made this discovery possible could never have imagined that their own bones, laid to rest in hastily dug mass graves during humanity's greatest recorded catastrophe, would one day provide scientists with the definitive final proof needed to fully and conclusively understand exactly what had actually killed them. Chapter 26. The trade that never fully stopped, even as it killed. Given everything already described about how the plague traveled along medieval trade routes, it would be reasonable commerce itself simply ground to a cold halt the Guard 3 hour. In genuine historical reality, the picture was considerably more complicated, and understanding why trade continued, even amid catastrophic mortality, reveals something important about the genuine economic pressures bearing down on medieval society. Merchants and traders, whatever the very real personal danger involved, faced powerful economic incentives to continue their business even during active outbreaks. Goods that suddenly became scarce due to disrupted production or transportation could command dramatically inflated prices, and merchants willing to accept the personal risk of continued travel and trade during outbreak periods could, in a considerable number of documented cases, secure genuinely substantial profits precisely because so many of their competitors had fled or ceased operations entirely out of understandable fear. This continued commercial activity, however economically rational from any individual merchant's perspective, undoubtedly contributed to the disease's continued spread between cities and regions, since the same trade networks and traveling merchants that had originally carried the plague from Central Asia to the Mediterranean continued operating, at least partially, throughout the outbreak's worst years, creating an uncomfortable and genuinely tragic feedback loop in which the very economic activity that medieval society depended upon for its basic functioning. Civic authorities in various affected cities grappled directly with this tension, attempting at various points to restrict trade and travel from known outbreak areas, while simultaneously recognizing that their own city's economic survival depended on maintaining at least some continued commercial activity, particularly regarding essential goods like food and basic supplies that urban populations depended upon and simply could not produce sufficiently within their own city walls. This tension between public health caution and basic economic necessity would recur in various forms throughout the plague's many subsequent outbreaks across the following centuries, reflecting a genuinely difficult and often imperfectly resolved balance between protecting public health and maintaining the basic commercial activity that any functioning society, medieval or otherwise, ultimately depends upon for its own survival. Some merchants and trading families, recognizing the genuine risk involved in continued travel during outbreak periods, developed their own informal protective measures, including efforts to avoid direct contact with potentially infected goods or travelers, and a general increased caution around trading partners from cities known to be currently experiencing active outbreaks. These informal precautions, while far less systematic than the formal quarantine measure that City 2's plates examined as one of pride mine, were a wild and painful experience, long before any formal scientific understanding of contagion existed to properly explain exactly why these precautions actually helped to reduce their own personal risk of infection. Chapter 27. The powerful who discovered that wealth offered no real protection. One of the plague's most genuinely striking features, and one that contributes significantly the Sleepless West length, royal and noble households across Europe experienced genuine, significant mortality during the plague years, demonstrating clearly to contemporary observers that no amount of wealth, comfortable housing, or access to the era's best available physicians could offer meaningful protection against a disease that medieval medicine simply had no effective means of treating or preventing. Members of royal families across various European kingdoms died during the plague's initial devastating wave and its subsequent recurrences, a fact that carried genuine significant symbolic weight in a society that had traditionally understood social hierarchy as reflecting a divinely ordained and fundamentally stable natural order. This demonstrated vulnerability of even the most powerful members of society contributed directly to the broader questioning of established religious and social authority already discussed in earlier chapters. Since a social and religious order that had traditionally claimed a kind of divine sanction and protection for its ruling class found that claim genuinely and visibly undermined by a catastrophe that showed no meaningful preference for protecting the powerful over the ordinary peasants and laborers who made up the great bulk of medieval society. The Church itself, despite its claims to special spiritual authority and protection, lost a significant proportion of its own clergy during the plague years, including, in some affected regions, senior religious figures whose deaths left considerable gaps in the Church's own institutional leadership and administrative capacity at precisely the moment when frightened, grieving populations most needed clear religious guidance and comfort. This clerical mortality, layered directly on top of the broader questioning of established authority already discussed, contributed meaningfully to the gradual erosion of unquestioned religious authority that some historians credit as one contributing factor among several that eventually helped enable the later Protestant Reformation. This experience has witness of rage have real like an 10-minute duration to describe demographic experience. A stark, undeniable demonstration that the Nelpos Middle Age, this medieval spadios of requiring to reasons, shark to cobligation at Crowan would despite in it. A decade of fluid like civil and grabbing to Vigan Cobbett quadrigator experiences. I've out of the depeable abbreviations, Tibble lock of it. It begins, as it so often did, with a single case that seems, at first, almost unremarkable. A traveling merchant passes through the village, staying one night at the local inn before continuing on his journey, entirely unaware that fleas traveling in his belongings have already begun spreading among the local rat population that shares every medieval settlement's grain stores and living spaces. Within a week, the innkeeper's own young son develops a fever, and soon after, the swollen, painful lymph node that every villager has, by this point in the plague's relentless spread across the wider region, learned to recognize with genuine and immediate dread. The village priest, drawing on whatever spiritual comfort and practical guidance he can offer, urges calm and continued faith even as he privately, quietly begins preparing for what he fears is coming. Within another week, 3 more households report illness, and the village's single physician, already exhausted from tending to cases in a neighboring town, arrives to offer what limited treatment he can, knowing from grim, accumulated experience across this plague season that his intervention will likely make little genuine difference to his patient's actual chances of survival. By the height of the outbreak, the village bell tolls with an exhausting, almost constant regularity, and the once bustling market square stands largely empty, its usual commerce and social gathering replaced by an eerie, fearful quiet broken only by the periodic passage of the cart, collecting the latest bodies for burial in the hastily expanded village graveyard. Families that once gathered together each evening now maintain careful distance from one another, even within their own households, as the terrifying uncertainty of who might already be carrying the disease undermines even the most basic, previously unquestioned bonds of physical closeness and comfort. And then, as mysteriously and as suddenly as it arrived, the outbreak begins to subside. That and paminin besimmering when their previous daily routines forever change man and in of 20 and private the waving of swavenik and that slactioning, that the bound of store brains means remain from a fatalic workout. And exactly how prackled. The labor shortage and resulting shift in economic power between peasants and landowners, already discussed at length, contributed directly to the gradual decline of the feudal system that had structured European society for centuries before the plague struck. As feudalism weakened, alternative economic and social structures gradually emerged in its place, including the growth of a more genuinely independent merchant and artisan class in Europe's cities, populations that increasingly operated outside the traditional feudal relationships between lord and peasant that had previously dominated the medieval economic landscape. The church, too, emerged from the plague years with its authority genuinely and lastingly diminished in the eyes of a population that had watched clergy die from the disease at rates similar to the wider population, undermining the sense of special spiritual protection or authority that religious leadership had traditionally claimed. Some historians point to this weakened religious authority as a contributing factor in the later Protestant Reformation, arguing that the plague's demonstration of the Church's practical helplessness in the face of genuine catastrophe planted early seeds of the broader skepticism toward established religious authority that would flower, more than a century later, into outright religious schism across significant portions of Europe. The population collapse itself, whatever its immense human tragedy, also had the paradoxical effect of increasing per capita wealth and resources across surviving European society, as the same amount of land, capital, and accumulated resources now had to support a dramatically smaller population. This increased per capita prosperity, combined with the newly mobile and newly empowered labor force already discussed, contributed to a gradual increase in living standards for many surviving Europeans in the decades following the plague. A genuinely striking and largely unintended silver lining emerging from an otherwise catastrophic demographic collapse. Many historians further argue that this combination of factors, weakened feudal and religious authority, increased per capita prosperity, and a labor force with genuinely new bargaining power and, increasingly, new geographic and social mobility, helped create conditions that contributed, across the following century, to the flowering of the Renaissance, the great cultural, artistic, and intellectual movement that would fundamentally reshape European civilization in the decades and intellectual following this catastrophic mid-14th century plague. It is a genuinely striking historical irony, worth sitting with directly, one of history's single greatest catastrophes, responsible for the deaths of tens of millions of people across just a few devastating years, may have also helped clear the way, through the sheer scale and completeness of the transformation it forced upon European society, for one of history's most celebrated periods of cultural and intellectual flourishing. Chapter 30. What carried them through. By now, you have a fuller picture of what the Black Death actually asked of the people who lived through it. It asked for the endurance of a mortality rate that killed, by the most careful modern estimates, somewhere between a third and a half of an entire continent's population within the span of just a few catastrophic years. It asked families to watch loved ones die within days of their first symptoms, with no effective medical treatment available anywhere to meaningfully change that outcome. It asked entire communities to abandon their most basic, cherished rituals around death and burial, simply to keep pace with a mortality rate that overwhelmed every system society had ever built to handle the ordinary, expected rhythm of human mortality. And for innocent Jewish communities across significant portions of Europe, it asked for the endurance of violent persecution and scapegoating layered directly on top of the same catastrophic mortality already devastating the wider population around them. It would be easy, hearing all of this, to see only unrelenting horror and unimaginable loss. And there is real, undeniable horror and loss woven through every single thread of this story. Horror that deserves to be remembered honestly rather than softened or minimized in service of a more comfortable telling. But it would be incomplete to leave the story there, because that isn't the whole picture either. What carried the survivors of this catastrophe through it, generation after generation, across recurring outbreaks that continued for centuries after the initial devastating wave, was much the same quiet, stubborn, human resilience we've encountered before in stories like this one. The courage of a small English village choosing collective sacrifice to protect its neighbors. The creative resilience of storytellers finding meaning and connection, even amid mass death. The practical resourcefulness of survivors who recognized and scanashtably, he with his pathic had it a bat the and it was, in its own complicated, almost unbearably costly way, transformation, the end of one historical era and the halting, uncertain beginning of another, built directly on the foundation of everything this catastrophe had first torn apart. The feudal system that had structured European life for centuries crumbled in the plague's aftermath. The rigid social and religious hierarchies that had once seemed permanent and unquestionable revealed themselves, in the face of this overwhelming catastrophe, to be considerably more fragile and more capable of change than anyone living before 1347 could likely have imagined. You would not have survived the Black Death easily. Almost no one did, in the sense of moving through it unscathed, untouched by loss, unchanged by what they witnessed. But an extraordinary number of people did survive it. The same way people have always survived history's hardest chapters. Not by escaping the catastrophe itself, which was, for most of Europe, simply unavoidable, but by finding, somewhere in the middle of overwhelming loss, enough courage, enough resourcefulness, and enough simple, stubborn determination to keep going, to rebuild what had been lost, and to carry forward into a transformed and uncertain new world, whatever fragile. Ishal poi surkuhaim tits human and uguayai fedmin and mad yankat could brohaikshan and mayanip. Let the bell fall silent now. Let the cart's wheels stop creaking against the cobblestones, and let the village settle, at last, into a quiet that is no longer touched by fear, only by the simple, enduring fact of having survived, carrying forward into whatever came next, the memory of everyone and everything this long, terrible season had taken from them. And so, our journey through the time of the Black Death comes quietly to an end. Tonight we've walked beside ordinary people who faced unimaginable uncertainty, yet somehow found the strength to keep living, one day at a time. History remembers the plague for the millions it claimed, but behind every chapter were countless lives filled with small acts of courage, hope, and resilience. Now let those distant church bells fade into silence. The villages grow peaceful once more. The candlelight grows dim, and the worries of another century drift gently away. If sleep has already found you, let it carry you into peaceful dreams. And if you're still listening, simply rest. Thank you for spending part of your evening here on the Sleepless Storyteller. Until next time, sleep well, rest deeply, and may your dreams be peaceful. Good night.